work in the past weeks. So what Nico and Kalle initially started off as an investigation turned out to be a very useful policy project. You will see the results of estimation of regional gross product in the absence of any official data. So this project is motivated by the lack of official statistics. It's a welcome insight into what we're dealing with in perhaps the first 3 months. But it also opens some other questions as we go forward, because these models cannot be checked against the reality of official data and so on and so forth. So this is, if you want, the backdrop. This is what we have to keep in mind as we're looking at these numbers. There's a lot of things that we've learned, I think, but there's even more things that we would like to explore that came out during our discussions. Anyway, so you know the standard in our seminar, Nico, is that we take questions as we proceed. So small clarification questions and so on and so forth, and we leave more substantive discussions towards the end of the seminar.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much, Mina. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity to share what we've done. So as Mina said at the beginning of the war, we started looking into this because we thought it would be helpful to you guys. So we're very happy to present these results. And the only goal of this project is to be helpful to you and to the government of Ukraine. So if at any point you have questions or you want to speak to us or you want to reach out and just chat about what we've done or what we think is going on, we'd be more than happy to work with you. So essentially what we're trying to do is we're trying to estimate current economic activity in Ukraine by region. So this is essentially the goal of the project. And of course, traditionally, you would measure GDP annually. More recently, we've started doing this quarterly. But there are 2 countries in the world that do it on a monthly basis. That's UK and Canada. But there are challenges of using and interpreting high-frequency GDP data because it's insanely volatile. So, of course, different months in a year will naturally have different amount of consumption and production because we have seasons. But also months with more weekends are going to have more consumption than production. So high-frequency GDP data is insanely volatile, and this needs to be kept in mind when you're interpreting this data, when you're looking at it. But it's still useful in a crisis because strong signals can cut through the noise and still show you something that you want to see. And in a crisis, decisions need to be made faster. So the faster you can get any data, the better. Just to give you an idea of what it looks like, this is monthly GDP data from the UK. And in the top panel, you can see the financial crisis. And you can see that during a traditional financial crisis or economic downturn, the volatile data is not necessarily useful when you compare month to month, because there's a lot of volatility. However, on the bottom panel, in the bottom panel, you can see COVID. And you can see that during the COVID pandemic, even the volatile data can be super useful because it shows you where you are, how bad things are getting. So you can see that the GDP dropped by around 30% pretty early on in the pandemic in the UK. Now, why are we doing this regionally? Well, national effects are usually aggregated from heterogeneous regional economies. And the point is that if the shock that you experience is heterogeneous across regions, and the economy is not identical in all the regions, then the regional breakdown is going to be important. And a war is inherently a regional crisis, especially a conventional war. And the regions that are affected the most are far from random. So it's not a coincidence that the Russians targeted Kyiv at the very beginning of the war. Like, this is far from random. Now, it may not be necessarily an economic argument, but it surely is correlated to the economy. So I'd like to start by showing you this data, which is basically a cross-section of data in 2020, and this is GDP by region. And the reason I'm showing you this is because I want to make the point that the economy of Ukraine is very uneven. So Kyiv itself, the city itself, is almost a quarter of the GDP, and combined with Kyiv Oblast, it's 30% of the GDP. And that's not unusual. There are many countries around the world where the capital city would be 25 to 30% of the economy. This is also the case for Ukraine. Now, the reason I think this is important is because if you combine all the other regions that have seen violence since the start of the war, they roughly add up to the same amount of GDP as Kyiv and Kyiv Oblast. And that's an important point because it suggests that if you just want to focus on GDP, Kyiv and its surroundings should be the focus of the policy. Now, of course, if your policy is worried about employment, equality, or growth, then maybe you want to be focusing on other areas. So by design, mechanically, our analysis is going to focus on GDP, and this has implications. So we focus on what I call GDP, but this is basically total economic activity. We try to measure total economic activity in an area. You can call it gross regional product if you don't like, call it domestic product. I prefer to work with micro data than macro data, and I believe that the GDP itself is an insane concept to measure, but this is the sort of universal measure of economic activity that we are using. So this is what we're going to report as a measure of economic activity. And if you want to know what economic activity is in whatever area you're trying to investigate, you have a choice between measuring and modeling. Now, of course, measuring is what most people like to do, especially in developed countries, but it's expensive, slow, and impossible during a war. The alternative is to model. And this is usually some sort of an out-of-sample prediction based on the structure of the model. And institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, they would use structural theory and they will make assumptions about different scenarios. And based on that, they will generate predictions of economic activity. You can also try to do a time series prediction based on past data if you believe that things are going to be developing the way they used to be developing in the past, which of course during a war is a big assumption to make. Or the last option that you have is you can make out of sample prediction using data that is correlated to GDP. And this is what we're going to be using today. And all indicators of GDP or economic activity are biased in one way or another. But we know that using big data is a great back of the envelope measure that provides good performance. It's reasonably fast. We were able to put it together in a couple of months. It's pretty effective, and it's reasonably well documented to be accurate. There are some challenges, and the challenges come from the fact that in order for us to predict something or to model something, we need to have good outcomes data. But our outcomes data is not as good as we'd like it to be. We have low frequency of observations. So for each of the regions, we only have 6 to 7 time periods, and the data is annual. And also the conventional current data that people would normally use for tracking real-time performance of an economy, payments, transactions, employment, that's unavailable at the moment. So what we're going to do is we're going to model everything in annual GDP. And if we are going to exploit a shorter period, like a day, a week, or a month, we're going to annualize the GDP based on that period. So we assume that the rest of the year is the same as that short period of time. We're going to use panel methods. So we're going to exploit variation not only over time, but also across regions. And we're going to use big data. So specifically, we're going to use Nightlights, Twitter, and Google Trends. I'm going to tell you more about this in a minute. We're not developing any new indicators. So all these 3 indicators have been shown and documented to be super highly correlated to GDP and work during the pandemic, during natural disasters. So, of course, we can't tell you that they work during a war, because nobody has done this before and it cannot be tested. But this is the best that we have. There's a couple of philosophical assumptions that we need to make, and those assumptions do make a difference. So they are important. They can be relaxed, but at the end of the day, we have to agree on something. So to start with, we're going to ignore regions that have been occupied by the Russians since 2014. So we're going to ignore Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea. We have data on these regions, so we can look into them. At the moment, we're not doing this just because it takes time and it's more complicated than other regions. We are going to model total economic activity within areas defined by Ukrainian regions. Now, this includes areas that are occupied or contested. We don't know what goes on in those regions. We don't know what kind of economic activity occurs there. We're going to assume that it manifests itself the same way it would manifest itself during normal times or during a natural disaster or a pandemic. But actually, we don't know. So this is an assumption we have to make. I don't even want to think about whether executing civilians is creating economic value for anybody. This is not a question that I want to answer. Somebody probably should try to think about this at some point, but I don't want this person to be me. And the last point, we model everything in 2004's hryvnia. This is just the first year for which we had data available. Now, if you don't want to listen to me talk for another hour, or if you have something better to do, I'm going to give you a really quick overview of the results. We find that if the rest of 2022 is the same as March, the economy shrinks by around 26%. We have different estimates that range between 18% and very pessimistic 50%. My favorite is 26%, and this is what the figures are based on that you can see on this slide. So in the top left-hand corner, you can see the modeled GDP based on Twitter and Google, and the measured GDP, which is the dashed line. And you can see that our model performs really well in levels, maybe not that great in changes, but this is just a feature of the data. And then we have a big drop in 2022. On the right-hand side, you can see the regional breakdown. You can see that the regions that have seen more violence are affected more heavily, and regions to the west are actually still growing. We think this growth is due to relocation of firms and people. One puzzling thing is that Kherson and the oblast around Kherson seems relatively lightly affected. I will touch upon this later on towards the end of the presentation. And now I'm going to hand over to my colleague Kalle, who's going to tell you more about data.
Great. So as Nico already mentioned, we cannot really go the way that like these big institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund do their nowcasting and forecasting exercises, which is in using lots of high frequency current data, for example, electronic payments data or some sector level indices like industrial indices or even expert surveys. So these are all not available for us. And this is why we decided to go for a slightly less conventional approach, which is connecting together data sets that are usefully correlated with GDP, but are not directly building blocks of GDP, as would be, for example, data on consumption activity and so on. And these three data sources we are using is Twitter activity, that is tweets that are sent by people or posted on Twitter. That is Google Trends, that means that are the search terms that people type into the Google search mask, and that's collected by Google. And then satellite images of nightlights. And the advantage of these three correlate data sets of GDP is that there's a reasonably large literature that documents how they are related or correlated with GDP, and even some speculation and modeling of how the mechanisms might actually work. So what actually binds together Twitter or tweet activity or nightlights and GDP. Let's go to the next slide. Right, Nico, thanks. So a quick word on Twitter. There's a 2-year-old paper in Regional Science and Urban Economics that documents that Twitter activity is a very good predictor of GDP. And the speculation is that the main channel through which this correlation arises is through to conspicuous consumption. And that also means that the correlation is especially large when you focus on tweets that contain media, like images or videos. Now, the problem is for our exercise, of course, we need Twitter data that is geolocated. So we want to predict regional activity. That means we have to locate each tweet that we are counting in our data set within a region. And only 1 to 2% of all tweets that are posted on Twitter are actually geolocated. That's still a large sample because Twitter is a huge thing. And we are exploiting essentially this data set. But the underlying assumption then, of course, is that the distribution across space of geolocated tweets is the same as the distribution of tweets that are not geolocated. And mind you, geolocation is a user choice. What we do is we just sample Twitter activity in the 1,000 largest settlements according to the latest census in Ukraine, and then aggregate it up to the regional level. So I mentioned that there is some speculation, some research on what channels link Twitter to GDP activity, but we are far from having established a clear idea of how these micro foundations work. So there's still some uncertainty how that works. And a problem in our data set is that our Twitter data is very much dominated by a large national trend. That is, Twitter was very popular in Ukraine around 2013, 2014. Then it slowly loosened popularity. As Nico already stressed, we are also exploiting the cross-sectional information in this data set. So this is not necessarily a problem, but we have to be aware of that. Let's go to the next slide. Our next big data source is Google Trends. That is search behavior by users on Google. And how this works, Google gives you access to indices of search behavior. That is, you can look up how certain search terms, how often they are searched for in relation to the total search volume. Now, what we are using here is not specific search terms, but so-called topics. Topics are collections of search terms that bind together different terms that signify the same underlying search goal. So and that importantly also span multiple languages and cultural zones. So differences, for example, in language use across Ukraine are not a problem for this data set. There's some documentation that using Google Trends as a GDP nowcaster works really well in normal times and also during a pandemic. So this is a paper by a person working at the OECD documenting that using Google Trends to nowcast GDP worked really well during the COVID-19 crisis. And that's the basic observation on which we built to argue that we can also use this to understand what's going on during a war. Let's go to the next slide. Here's just an example of these topics that we use. So mind you, again, we are not only including the actual English language search term investment, but also their analogs in other languages all across the world, and importantly, of course, Ukrainian and Russian. And you can see that some of these topics can have an expected significance rather on the firm side. So what firms do, what kind of economic activity they do. Other topics rather have a connection to what consumers do. We are using a collection of roughly 30 topics here that are informed by what other people did before in the literature. Right. Our third input data set is satellite images of night lights. So those are satellites orbiting Earth, and they're taking a picture at night of the surface of the Earth every day or every night. There is a larger tradition. So this has been used in the economics literature for a longer time. One foundational paper here is certainly the Henderson et al. Paper in 2012. And they document a stable log linear relationship between nightlight intensity, that is the luminosity within a region across all pixels on the raster image that comes from the satellite, over area, and GDP. They also show that nightlight intensity is useful to estimate irregular activity and also deflate unreliable GDP estimates that come from countries where maybe statistical infrastructure is not too well developed. And importantly, also works during natural disasters and conflict. So in times that are not normal. Now, in the traditional literature, there has been a lot of discussion on what's problematic with this kind of data. But since the launch of NASA's Black Marble product that runs all the raw raster images that come from the satellites through a sophisticated algorithm and cleans them up cleans them, for example, with regards to cloud covers, luminosity reflection from snow, and so on. We now have access to a data set that is really harmonized and it runs from 2012 until now, and that's enough for us. So we're using this NASA Black Marble database, and we do not really have to worry about all these traditional problems that have been connected to the night lights data. Right, just to give you kind of a visual impression, because we think this helps you to get a better idea of what this data looks like. This is just the annual composite. So think of this as an average across all days of the year 2012. And the nightlight luminosity in Ukraine and the pixels that are lit in yellow, they have a high luminosity value, and those that are in deep blue, they have a very low luminosity value. And you can see here something that is very intuitive and very clear. We see a lot of nightlight activity, of course, in the capital, in Kiev and the surrounding region, and also in other regional hubs. Let's go to the next slide, which is showing you the same image 9 years later in 2021. And if you had, well, thank you, Nico, for that. So if you quickly switch back and forth, you can see that there is actually variation that is coming from the time dimension. Looking at this from outer space, it doesn't seem like much, but the good thing is there's lots of pixels within each region, and the signal is very fine. This is a scale that helps us to extract both the variation that comes from a time dimension and across region. So this is just showing you the regional change in the nighttime luminosity between those 2 years. We just showed you in percentage terms, and you can see a very clear pattern. So we see, according to this measure, for example, that in these northwestern regions, including the capital of Kyiv, and then what's that, Dnipropetrovsk, exactly, we have actually an increase, or at least an increase in nighttime luminosity, whereas in many other regions we have a decrease in nighttime luminosity. Let's go to the next slide, which is showing you the situation in March 2022. So this is only the month of March 2022. And here you can clearly see that this data source also gives us very sharp variation during crisis events, like, for example, the invasion of Ukraine. So this is clearly reflecting a mix of a downscaling of economic activity and voluntary switching out of lights, which was, of course, in policy in Ukraine in March 2022. And it's also showing us that we get a very clear and strong signal from this kind of data set when things really turn from normal into a very unusual situation. And that's it on the data set. Happy to come back to it later on in the discussion.
Thank you, Kalle. Now I'm going to tell you a little bit about the methods that we are using. Essentially, we have 3 very simple steps. So first, we need to get all the data. So that's GDP, Twitter, Google Trends, and nightlights at regional level over time. Then we're going to fit a really simple panel model of GDP on the left-hand side as a function of Twitter, nightlights, and Google Trends. And then we're going to use that model. So we have data for Twitter, nightlights, and Google Trends for 2022. And we're going to use this model to generate out-of-sample predictions for 2022. Now, of course, the key to getting this right is making sure that the model holds and that the parameters of the model hold even during a war. Now, it sounds like a big assumption to make during a war, but as I said before, it has worked during the pandemic, it has worked during natural disasters, and we will eventually find a way to validate it somehow. So hopefully, this is the best we have at the moment, but it's giving us results that are reasonably intuitive, but it also gives us results that are reconcilable with what other people have done using other methods. So hopefully this gives you some confidence in the fact that what we're doing might actually be useful. So the first regression that we run is GDP on the left-hand side, nightlights on the right-hand side. With regional fixed effects, they're insanely accurate. And this is because the vast majority of our variation comes from variation across regions rather than within regions over time. But also, even without the fixed effects, nightlights seem to be doing a really good job predicting the variation. Again, they do an excellent job in a cross-section, a slightly less excellent job over time, just because the data that we have over time isn't as variable as the data that we have that varies across regions. So this is the GDP predicted by nightlights alone. And you can see that it's relatively stable in Kyiv over time, and then there's a big drop in 2022. The same happens in Samska, Dnipropetrovska. In Zakarpatska, however, you can see that there's actually an increase. We don't know if this is a feature of the data or this is due to the fact that companies and people relocate to an area that is considered safe. Now, of course, we think that the drops that you see in Kyiv and Dnipropetrovsk, they're pretty dramatic, also in Sumy too. They're really dramatic, and we think that a large proportion of this is coming from the policy to switch lights off at night, rather than a drop in economic activity. So we are a little skeptical of how trustworthy this data is. But given how much validation it received from the literature already, we are going to include them in at least some of our regressions. The next regression that we run is on the left-hand side, we have GDP, and on the right-hand side, we have the 30 indices of Google Trends. Now, of course, we do have a fat data problem because we have a short time series and 30 explanatory variables. So we don't really know which explanatory variables to use. The way we do this in this regression is we just throw them in a linear regression. We have tried the lasso approach, and it suggests that all the variables should be kept in. So it feels like there is more that we could try to get out of playing with the functional form. But at the moment, it looks like just a linear regression is incredibly good with fixed effects, with region fixed effects, but also very, very good, even better than nightlights in a cross section without fixed effects at all. So again, a pretty good. It's pretty good over time. It's excellent in a cross section. So these are the results for GDP over time using just Google Trends. In Kyiv, you see a lot more volatility than suggested by nightlights, but a smaller drop in 2022. In Zakarpatska, you don't see an increase anymore. You see a drop, but that drop is nothing unusual. So it's very similar to what has happened in Zakarpatska before, and it's not the biggest drop that we see in that region over time. In Sumska, the same. You see that there is a drop, but that drop is not as massive as suggested by nightlights. In Dnipropetrovsk, that's slightly different because the drop is both very dramatic and unusual for the region. And the last regression or series of regressions that we run is we put GDP on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, we have the number of tweets. And again, in a cross-section, the performance is excellent. With region fixed effects, the performance is excellent. Over time, the performance is not great. It's not terrible, but we get an R-squared of around 25%, which is not fantastic. So this is what Twitter predicts. You can see the national trend that Kalle mentioned before. So there's a huge increase in popularity of Twitter around 2014, and then it drops off. Now, what you can definitely see in this graph is that there's a remarkable drop in the number of tweets in 2022. And the drop differs in different regions. So in Dnipropetrovsk, it's a lot smaller than it is in Kyiv. In Zakarpatska, again, it's a drop rather than the increase suggested by nightlights. In Sumska, again, you have a drop in 2022. So this is Twitter in a cross section. So in 2020, I just wanted to make sure that everybody's on the same page. And I know people say that Twitter is not very popular in Ukraine, But actually in 2020, if you compare the measured GDP, which is at the bottom axis, to modeled GDP using Twitter alone, nothing else, just the number of tweets, you can see that the cross-sectional performance of Twitter is actually pretty good. So you can tell me all day long that Twitter is not popular in Ukraine. The data seems to speak for itself. Now, of course, the reason we use 3 indicators rather than any one of them is because if the errors, the prediction errors of those 3 different indicators are not correlated with each other, then the performance of the model that combines the 3 is going to be better than the performance of any single one of them. And we can test this. We can test if the errors are correlated or not. And this is what I'm reporting in the table at the bottom of this slide. And you can see that the correlation between Google Trend errors and Twitter errors is very low. The correlation between nightlight errors and Twitter errors is reasonably high. And the correlation between nightlight errors and Google Trend errors is actually negative. So it looks like Twitter and nightlights are reasonably complementary, as in reasonably good substitutes for each other, because they seem to be capturing the same effects, whereas Google is a really good complement to any of those. I think there's a question on chat. Yeah, so Pablo, that's a really good point. It could. We don't know if it does. So this is exactly like, that's the exact same point I made when somebody mentioned this to me when I was planning to use the nightlight. But then we don't know whether it does. So this is something we would have to test, and I am going to test whether this is accurate or not. If we can show that nightlights are accurate even during the war, that would be insane, and we would definitely find that super useful. And I agree with that point. If it turns out that you close the blinds and you stop working at the same time, that would be helpful. But it is also possible that you close the blinds to avoid being targeted, but then continue working even despite the fact that your windows are shut. And then also you have the effect of smoke and fires. So if your area is being bombed and there are fires all around the city, those fires are going to contribute to nightlight luminosity, but they probably don't really contribute to economic activity. And then those fires generate smoke, and that smoke is going to obscure light from other sources that are actually reflecting economic activity. So the short answer is we're still looking into this, and your point is really good, but we need to think about this more, and we need to run some more tests on this. But I think it's a fair point. Thank you for raising this.
And I think we should also mention that what Nico was mentioning before, that you could keep working even though there is no light, is the explanation that we can give regarding the investment component of GDP. But if you think about the consumption component of GDP, if people don't go out to restaurants, if there is no activity in the city and so on and so forth, no open cafes and etc., whether that's missing and the lights are off because people are scared to go or because they're told not to go, the end result is more or less the same. But of course, this is the point is this is a pretty complex problem, because we're trying to capture with this one variable effects that are definitely going to be heterogeneous across the GDP components. So actually, the argument that works in favor of using nightlights for consumption work against nightlights for investment, for example, and stuff like this. So it's definitely not awesome. But the issue is we only have yearly GDP, right? So we don't have a higher frequency target to be able to understand where the error might be if they cancel out over time across regions, across components, and so on and so forth.
Thanks, Mina. Yes, that's a really good point. But I think we're still looking into this, and then hopefully we can find some evidence to show whether nightlights are useful or not. At the moment, we just don't know. And we will show you some results with nightlights, and you can decide for yourself how trustworthy you think the results are. In fact, the specifications I'm going to show you, three specifications. We obviously tested a lot more than that. I'm going to show you the three because the first two are the most intuitive. So these were the first three that most people I have spoken to mentioned. And the third one I'm going to show you because that's my favorite, that gives the results that I like the most. So the first specification is basically GDP on the left-hand side. And on the right-hand side, there is log of tweets. There is a region-specific coefficient for Google Trends, and then non-linear combination of nightlight intensity. And then the second specification is the same as the first one, except it has region fixed effects. Okay, so two questions on chat. Why, from Alexandra, the contribution of industry, which still can work without lights, is higher than the contribution of restaurants and other entertainment. Maybe, but that could be true. I don't actually know if this is true, because if you look at the data that I showed in my introduction, the vast majority of GDP comes from Kyiv, and 60% of Ukrainian GDP comes from services. So that may be true. I mean, look, if I close the blind in my house, I can still write economic papers. So that is certainly possible. And then that light still exists, except I manipulate how much of it is being emitted into the atmosphere. So this is why I don't trust nightlight, because the service economy can still largely function when lights are obscured. They're not necessarily off, but they're just obscured. So I agree with that point, and this is why I don't like nightlights. But again, this is something we would probably need to support with data and try to tease out the answer to whether nightlights are accurate or not. So I think this is a point that is attracting a lot of attention. So we will need to look into this. Thank you. And the second point from Vitaly, do you control for population differences across regions? So in a cross section, yes. Now, of course, what we don't know is the changes in population. So the variable that we get from Google is completely insensitive to changes in population, unless the changes in population are also correlated to changes in preferences. And this is why we really hope that using Twitter is going to be helpful, because Twitter is sensitive, very sensitive to changes in population. So we don't have a control for population. And in fact, this is the major blind spot of this project. And this is what we really desperately try to get data on at the moment, which is how population changes. So that the levels are not a problem for us. So that sort of cross-sectional changes in population aren't a problem, but the changes in population over time is something that we worry about, and this is the big missing variable in our regressions. So that's absolutely spot on. In terms of changes, this is a problem. Okay, so now I'm going to show you some results. So what you see on this figure is the dashed line is the measured GDP at national level, and the different colored lines are modeled GDP using Google Trends only, nightlights only, Twitter only, and then a combination of the three together. And what I want to show in this figure is that combining the three gives a much better fit of the data than using any of them alone, despite the fact that all of them have been shown to be really good fits for GDP. So I'm going to show you the regression results. Obviously, the coefficients are completely meaningless at this stage, but what I do want you to get from this figure is that the three specifications give you a drop in GDP in 2022 of between 50% and 22%. And in the first column, you see the most intuitive specification without fixed effects, but with night lights. You know, it's super dramatic. It suggests a drop in GDP of 50%. What we have done in our regressions is we kept 2021 out of sample, and we use 2021 to generate out of sample predictions, and then we test our out of sample predictions against the data that we have for 2021. And the prediction of the first model of GDP growth in 2021 is 14%. So that sounds like there is a lot of variation in this model that is coming from other sources than the actual underlying changes in GDP, because what Mina tells me GDP growth in 2021 was at national level was around 3%. So although this model has a really high R squared, I don't really trust it, mainly because of the fact that it's so pessimistic, but also because of the fact that it includes night lights, and I'm not crazy about what night lights can tell you in our current setting. In the second column, you see the same model, but with region fixed effect. So it's going to take out all the differences between regions that don't vary over time. So, you know, infrastructure, population, all of those effects. And we see that the prediction for 2021 is actually 2.5%, which is super close to what the actual growth was. And the prediction of growth in 2022 is just minus 22%. And of course, an insanely high R squared, 99.7%. And this is coming mostly from the fixed effect. Now, I still don't like this result, mostly because it assumes that the fixed effects don't change over time. My intuition is that if the roads are being bombed and destroyed, if houses are being blown up, if factories are being bombed, then the fixed effects will change. So I don't actually believe that fixed effects are stable all the time. So I think that the minus 22% is an overly optimistic estimate of changes in economic performance. And this is why I like the third column the most. So I take out night lights, I take out fixed effects, and I still get something with a really high R squared. I get a prediction of growth in 2021 of 6.5%, but 3% is within the 95% confidence interval. So that model doesn't actually disagree with Minea in terms of saying what the growth was at national level in 2021. And the prediction for 2022 is minus 26%. And I will show you some confidence intervals later on in the presentation. So cross-sectional results for the first model, as I said, it's super dramatic, but what I also don't like about it is that it really looks like the areas that have seen a lot of violence seem to perform relatively well. So areas to the north, east of Kyiv seem to be performing really well, whereas there are areas in the north that haven't seen any violence at all that seem to be performing really, really poorly. So not only the model doesn't seem to be giving results that are reconcilable with other sources, but it also doesn't give results that are intuitive in a cross-section. So this is why when we go to the second model, it's actually giving something a little more credible, because now you can see that the areas that have seen violence are affected much more significantly than areas in the West, with the exception of Kherson, which seems to be very lightly affected in all models. So in all specifications that I run, it looks like Kherson is actually not that badly affected, which seems to suggest that the economic activity in Kherson may not have dropped by as much as it has in other areas for one reason or another. And then my favorite specification, which is number 3, I really like it because it seems to show very dramatic decreases in economic activity in the East, but increases in economic activity, modest increases in economic activity in the West, which is exactly what I would expect given the migration of people and firms from East to West. And this is driven mainly by Twitter data. So the heterogeneity, the regional heterogeneity is driven mainly by Twitter data. And this is consistent with what we think about changes in population, and probably not just population of people, but also in population of firms. So one other thing that we can do is we can take it all the way down to daily data. So this is what you see in this figure is daily data, daily GDP predicted by Google Trends. And what you see is at the very beginning of the war, Ukrainian activity predicted by Google Trends drops by around 30%. But later, towards the end of March, the activity recovers to around 80% of the value before the war. So there are 2 messages here. One is that there is a very dramatic drop at the beginning of the war. That's hardly surprising. But the second message is that towards the end of March, there seems to be a small recovery of economic activity. I think as uncertainty, a large proportion of uncertainty about how the war is going to unfold is going away. And one other thing that I wanted to point out is in the bottom right-hand corner, you can see Kherson, and you can see that there is very little that happens at the very beginning of the war. There seems to be something that resembles a downward trend that begins at the end of March, but it's hard to tell what's actually going on. What I think might be going on in Kherson is that because it was taken over so quickly, chances are that the immediate economic activity was not affected as sharply as elsewhere, but there will be a downward trend. There will be a slow decline of economic activity over time. So last point I wanted to make is I wanted to give you some confidence intervals. I wanted to give you some external validation for the numbers that we're reporting. So what you see on the right-hand side is the graph from the introduction, but now with confidence intervals superimposed on the data. So you can see that the blue dots is the model, and that the model does a pretty good job predicting levels of GDP, not a great job predicting changes. And this is purely because confidence intervals are relatively large compared to the changes. Now, that doesn't mean that it's useless at the moment, because the change right now is so large that it falls way outside of the confidence interval that we have graphed on this figure. So it looks like the change that we are predicting can credibly be inferred from our data. So our confidence interval for my favorite prediction, which is -26, is it falls somewhere between -32 and -20%. The mean value across the 3 models, which is an insane thing to report, I know, especially given the fact that I don't like 2 of those models. But you know, it is something that you can back out of the calculations that we have done, and it's -33%. Now, if you compare it to what others have done, so the IMF predicts a drop of -35% in 2022, which we think is plausible. It's not too far off from what we estimated in March 2022. The ERBD estimates -30%, slightly more optimistic, still plausible, very close to what we've estimated in March 2022. And the World Bank says it's going to be -45%, which we find extremely unlikely. The reason we find -45% extremely unlikely is because now that we know that Kyiv is no longer under siege, this is a huge deal for the Ukrainian economy. And now that we know that the economic activity in Kyiv and around Kyiv is coming back, this is going to have a really big effect on overall economy of the country. In fact, we think 35% is pessimistic, and at 30% in fact is pessimistic, but that depends on how the war will unfold, on the damage to the infrastructure and how much productivity is lost due to infrastructure. Now, I have to stress that the assumptions and methods are critical to arriving at those conclusions. We are trying to be as transparent as possible about what we do and how we do it. It's not something I can say about others. World Bank, IMF, they're not forthcoming with the methods and code. So we can't really validate our results against what they're doing. We think transparency is important, but also definitions are not obvious. So when you say you're going to estimate Ukrainian GDP, do you mean from the territory that Ukraine controls, or do you mean from the areas that were Ukrainian before the full-scale invasion, or do you mean from the regions that are considered Ukrainian by the Ukrainian government and have been occupied partially by the Russians since 2014? So these are very important decisions that the people who try to estimate Ukrainian GDP need to make, but it's hard to compare different models without knowing what decisions others have made in their models.
So it's important to add here that the estimates that you have here shown are based on very straightforward relationships between data and I would say relatively unassuming assumptions, if one can say so. If one is doing these forecasts using some model-based thing, one also needs to make some assumptions regarding intensity of hostility, duration of hostility, what is being lost, and so on and so forth. They can be quite useful if you have, industrial detail or other type of detail, but those assumptions become quite critical in this. And without the assumptions, we don't know why it could be 45 or why it could be 35 in a model-based thing. Whereas here, the correlates are, if we believe the correlates are stable and they're good, they give us exactly what we see. So these numbers are what the correlates are telling us. They're not the result of assumptions about duration or intensity of hostility and so on and so forth. And the other thing I wanted to mention, and when Nico was presenting the regional things, we kind of have an understanding of what happens in the region, but most likely not as good as our colleagues in policy, because some regions that are maybe agricultural predominantly focused, if February, March, April is a critical month for preparing the next season. So a lot of, in a sense, a lot of GDP is happening through various different channels, as opposed to if the war was happening sometimes in summer when everybody was on a holiday, right? So these seasonal effects are very different depending on the structural, the industrial structure of the particular region. And I think we're starting to look into this with my colleagues in the unit. We're trying to get some idea about employment and so on and so forth, to figure out if we can add more explanations to the results that Nico was showing before. So we also have, Nico, we have a question in the chat.
Yes, the question is from Shizan. Thanks for the question. So the question is whether we can verify the data with change in land use from satellites. So in theory, normally that would be great. I don't think the change in land use is going to be as fast as our data, because we do this on a monthly basis or on a daily basis. Now, you're right in saying that if a building gets destroyed, we would be able to see it from satellite data. The problem with this is that we don't have access to high resolution satellite data, because that's considered sensitive for security reasons. So, and also it's very expensive. So you can get that data in principle, We haven't looked at it because it's considered sensitive and it's not been made publicly available. Now, of course, long term, people have used things like night lights and changes in land use to measure the effect of the war. So this has been done in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, but these applications usually do not happen while there is still violence in the region, because it's the violence that we're worried about, people trying to obscure their activities because they're worried about being targeted. So this is why we don't trust nightlights at the moment. I think, you know, as soon as hostilities stop, nightlights are going to be super useful again. But as long as there is violence, it's hard to trust nightlights. Satellite data would be super useful if we have it. But even then, there's only so much you can get out of it, because changes in land use do not happen that quickly. So yes, I think Mina made an excellent point, saying that we are the only ones that are actually using real-time data rather than model and simulate the effects based on structural assumptions. So I think this is the key difference, but also this means that our estimates are backward-looking and short-lived. So we're not going to tell you what is going to happen in, I don't know, September 2022. We can only tell you what has already happened and what impact that had on economic activity, which, you know, is useful because it's empirical work that is actually estimating something that has already happened. And it can inform people that are looking into the future and try to estimate, okay, what is going to be the impact of these things that will happen in the future. And that brings me to my last slide, which is my conclusions. I mean, GDP indicators, I really think that my favorite set of results is very intuitive. You know, a drop of 26% in economic activity is roughly similar to what has happened in the UK during COVID, the first month of COVID, and we had a pretty dramatic and unexpected lockdown. But of course, it's completely impossible to test these results, and because the real data, measured GDP data, is not available now and probably never will be. We will try to validate the data against other variables that we can find. You know, maybe we can get data, as Mina said, on employment. Maybe we can get data on movement of population, and then we can try to validate our results. But it's never going to be directly tested against GDP data, which will probably never exist. So the key point that I think you can take away from this presentation: at the start of the war, economic activity reduced by between 20 and 40%, with my best guess being around 30. The first month was pretty dramatic, but then activity increased. I really think that winning the Battle of Kyiv is a major economic victory, because that's the most important region for the nation's GDP, and it's going to have huge implications. And because of this alone, I think, that the forecast of a drop of 45% in GDP due to the war seems very unlikely. I don't know what it's going to be, but if we're talking about the 45% drop in GDP, I think Kyiv would have to be taken by the enemy, and a large number of other regions too. And only then we can talk about a drop of GDP of 45%. So I think at the moment it's relatively unlikely, and hopefully the situation is only going to get better militarily. So as I said, we are more than happy to answer any questions, have a conversation. We're trying to be open and transparent about everything that we do. And if you don't like anything that we do, or if you think we should be doing something else, tell us, because all we're trying to do with this project is be useful to people who find it hard to work at the moment. So that concludes the presentation. And if you have any questions, I'm more than happy to have a discussion.
Thanks, Nico. Any questions? Sorry. Any questions, any comments on the stuff we've seen?
Right. The construction of Google Trend indicators. So let me go back to the slide. So essentially, what the indexes are. So Google will give you the share of the searches for your particular topic out of all searches in the specified region over the specified time period. And then what it basically tells you is how popular the search for a specific topic was in the area that you are looking for, looking at over a specific time period. So what we have done is we collected that data for 30 different topics, and the topics are relatively arbitrary. In our case, they were guided by the literature. So the literature said, oh, these things are highly correlated. Searches for these topics are highly correlated with GDP. So we took those topics and plugged them into our regression. And we have 30 different topics. And essentially what we do is we have a value of how popular a specific topic is in a specific region over a specific time period, and we keep the time period constant across all regions, and we plug that into a regression, and then the regression tells us how closely that data correlates with GDP. And then based on that, we predict GDP using just those indices, and that prediction is our index of Google Trends. So basically, the GDP predicted just by changes in the topics is our index of what we think Google tells us about GDP. If that's not clear, I'm more than happy to take you through the code and take you through the process. And it's a little fiddly. I think it would be helpful also for me to send you a link to the paper that summarizes the methods, because I think it's interesting. And honestly, as a micro person, I was blown away by how insanely good Google Trends are at predicting levels and changes of economic activity. It's scary. It's just the goodness of it, that the accuracy is scary. Hopefully that answers the question. More than happy to answer any other questions if there are any.
Could I ask a question?
Sure, of course.
Okay, now hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians struggled in the battle with Russia. Could you assume that it's calculate this as services, like services which is part of GDP or no? Of course, it's very unusual proposition, but nevertheless, the people provide the services for struggle for Ukraine. And since a lot of the men, what do you think?
So one thing we can't do with this is make predictions, because what we do is we analyze data and we tell you what the effects are or what the effects were. In terms of sort of making predictions of what would happen if in that scenario or another scenario, that's not something that we can test with the model, because the model is a little, so it's kind of a black box. We don't really know what is being captured and what isn't. And that's obviously a problem of the model, but this is the best thing that we have at the moment. Now, in terms of specific services, you need to decide on what type of services you want in your economic activity and what type of services you don't want. And this is, again, a philosophical question that the modeler needs to make. We are avoiding this question by just, putting all of this in a black box. If you have a very specific
Yeah, Nico, I think we have an easier answer. I don't think that military services are actually part of, I mean, investment in military assets and stuff like this is normally part of GDP, but the act of providing a service, I'm not sure is captured as such. Of course, it's absolutely necessary because without security, you don't build anything, but GDP somehow takes that for granted, you know, like, that we have a legal order and social peace and stuff like that.
I think military service is usually part of government spending.
Yeah.
But you're absolutely, so the point I was trying to make is you have to decide on what stuff constitutes GDP or not, and this is exactly what I was trying to avoid when I was saying I don't know if you know, shooting civilians or stealing stuff or looting creates economic activity. I mean, it is economic activity for the Russians. They seem to benefit from it, but it's not a question that I want to answer. So I think this is something somebody should think about, but my answer to this question is I just don't know.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And
a good question.
Sorry, another question. Mm-hmm. I will be later to started for listening your presentation, but light method, you mean the correlation between light from satellite and the GDP, I think it's not very good in situation with Ukraine in the war, because a lot of the lights switch off from security purposes. And I think that it's so big divergence between real lighting and the assessment of GDP activity.
Agreed. Yes, I think so. This is a point that has been raised earlier in the presentation, both by Kalle, myself, and others in the audience. I think we all agree that there are problems with this. We don't know how serious those problems are. The switching of the lights may be correlated with a loss in economic activity, but it may not be. And the simple answer is we don't know. So it's impossible to measure, and this is exactly why I'm very skeptical of using night lights in my predictions. And in fact, you know, if you look at the results, the night lights seem to be incredibly dramatic. And I think they're far more dramatic than any other prediction, and that suggests to me that they are overestimating the drop. So I don't know, but sort of intuitively, that's what I think the data is showing. But I completely agree with you. I think this is the easiest the most obvious problem with using night lights.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Good questions. There's a question on chat about why is night lights not good for agriculture? Well. So this is, again, something about the microstructure of what nightlights are capturing and what aren't they capturing. The common assumption about nightlights is that light at night is a normal good. And that means that you use more of it as your income goes up, because this is something that you just consume. Why is it not useful in predicting agriculture? I presume it's because agriculture is less concentrated, so it's more spread out. Or growth in agriculture is more spread out over space. And because we are not actually using night lights, but nightlight intensity, which is the luminosity divided by an area, I presume that small changes in agriculture that are really dispersed across space may not be well captured by night lights.
And most agriculture happens during the day.
Good point.
And to add to that, I mean, that's also just a finding that we know from a lot of papers from the development economics literature, where this is the main concern.
Yes, so there are papers that have reported this. And yes, I'm more than happy to share the slides. They're not PowerPoint slides, I'm afraid. It's latex code, but I'm more happy to share it as long as Mina tells me that I'm allowed to. I'm more than happy to make it available.
Yeah. So just to Pini's point, our first interest was to actually get electricity consumption by region, because electricity consumption is more honest in a sense. So the issues that we discussed before, if you actually have to do production in a closed shop and so on and so forth, you would still capture this. Even if there's no lights, you still can use a lot of electricity. So this would give us perhaps a more accurate and picture. Unfortunately, we don't have the electricity breakdown. The same thing happens with respect to gasoline consumption, which was diverted to allow people to flee. And we have anecdotal evidence that farmers are having a tough time now finding gas to start the spring works. So what you see here are a bunch of second best options to a lot of things that we thought and discussed that strike a balance between availability of data and sufficient correlation to our target, which is very, very randomly, very, very seldomly measured, because we only have the yearly thing there.
Yeah, so on the back of this, there's a question from Olena on chat, which is, have we tried using Facebook rather than Twitter? We have tried, but Facebook is less forthcoming with their data than Twitter. Twitter is kind enough, or has been kind enough, to make their data available to us right away and free of charge. We have asked Facebook for that type of data, and instead they told us that they could give us something completely different, and not for Ukraine, but for neighboring countries, which isn't something that is going to be very useful. But also, we know that Twitter data is correlated with GDP. We don't know that for Facebook. So Twitter data has been shown to be correlated with GDP. There is a paper about this. It has been tested, and it has gone through the peer review process. Facebook data has not been used in that way, presumably because Facebook is not very forthcoming with the data, so they don't share it with academics. So it's hard to know. But if you have access to Facebook data, we'd be delighted to try to use it and to see whether it performs better than Google. So again, really good question about whether we can look more closely at Kherson and see exactly what words are not varying or varying in Kherson. And yes, so actually, anecdotally, I that's exactly what I did. So it turns out that people in Kherson are still looking for Calvin Klein and BMWs at the same intensity as before the war. I honestly don't know why. I don't know if it's Russian soldiers that just stole some really nice goods and want to find out how much they're worth, or is it people that for some reason benefited from the war and they're trying to consume, or maybe it's Russian sympathizers that have received payments. I don't know. The data is what it is. And we haven't done that in a systematic way, but looking at specific words and specific topics in different regions is something that we'd like to do, and sort of explore more deeply exactly where the variation is coming from. Is it coming from people looking for, worried about interest rates and savings, or is it coming from people that are trying to consume luxury goods? We haven't done that. We are thinking about this. We are a little short-handed at the moment because this is a project that Kalle and I have been doing in our free time over evenings and weekends. So we haven't done that yet, but that's an excellent idea, and it would be great to look at this at some point. But that's a great point. Thank you. Correlation between Facebook and Twitter data in neighboring countries to check. Well, Twitter is more popular in neighboring countries. So in neighboring countries, it's the fact that Twitter is not popular is not the problem. So in Poland, in Belarus, in Hungary, Twitter is pretty popular. So we could check if Facebook is just as good as Twitter at predicting right. So another question about Facebook. Again, great idea if you have the data. It's not something that is available to us at the moment, so it's more of a hypothetical discussion. If we could get the data, it would be great. At the moment, the data we can get from Facebook is just not very useful. Yeah, so I do have it somewhere. The share of it's actually something Mina wanted me to include in the presentation, and I thought it wouldn't be very useful. So I think there's a slice of a humble pie that I need to eat right now. But the share of tweets out of the country tweets against the share of GDP looks virtually the same as the GDP predicted by Twitter at a cross-sectional level. So as I mentioned in this slide, we can argue all day long about the fact that Twitter is not very popular, but at least in a cross-section, the correlation of GDP that is measured at regional level and modeled by Twitter is extremely high. The coefficient is, I think, 0.99, and R squared is very high. So at least at a cross-sectional level, it is very, very high. I mean, we still do have a problem with the national trend, but in a cross-section, Twitter is actually excellent. So I do appreciate that it's not as popular as Facebook, but we're not making an argument that it is. We're just making an argument that, like in other places around the world, in Ukraine, Twitter is correlated with GDP, and this is something that our data can support. So I don't necessarily see a problem with that. Now, would Facebook data be useful? That depends on what Facebook data we would get. We would still have to validate this. We would still need to try to correlate it to GDP, which we can't do because the data is simply not available. So
Nico, I can share that chart really fast before we sort of wrap up, if it's okay for you guys. If you stop sharing screen, then I would, or I can send it to you and you can, right. Let me just quickly show you this. So this is to this point. This is the cross section. This is the linear regression, basically, between shares of tweets at the regional level out of national and share of GDP at the regional level out of national. Each dot that you have here is basically a region, and the colors give you years. So that shows you the regional relationship. It's fairly good, and the share of tweets are a very decent proxy to a share of GDP, which is why we the results that Nico was showing indicate that in the cross section we have this very good explanatory power of Google numbers, Google levels, if you wish. Yes, I'll just stop here.
Yeah, so there's one more question about internet connection. Do we have data on internet connection, because Twitter and Google depend on a good connection? Actually, they don't, because it turns out that it's something you can really easily move in time. So if I want to search for BMWs or Calvin Klein or even interest rates, I can do it right now, but I can also do it later when I have a good internet connection. So if the connection actually doesn't have to be that great for an internet search or to download Twitter data. Now, if we want to have a conference and talk to people on video link, then yes, the connection has to be really good. But actually, Google searches and Twitter, it's a low bandwidth activity, something you can do with really bad connection. It's cheap, it's fast, but we don't have data on internet connection. Now, recently, the Russians started diverting some of the internet traffic through the Russian servers in the occupied regions. But the good news that we can track that as well, because they're not blocking Google searches, or they're not blocking, although they might be blocking Twitter, because I think it's now banned in Russia. So we will have to look into that. That's a good question. Thank you.
Okay, everybody, many thanks. If there are further things, let's catch up over email. Most likely we'll see another iteration of this because there's a bunch of things we want to do, like extract factors after the 30 trends. We want to do some deviations to account for that trend that Kalle was showing, and so on and so forth. So this is going to be, there's going to be a bunch of things happening there. Again, Kalle and Nico left their email. Please don't be shy and write them if you have other ideas. Otherwise, many thanks for your attention. We're all running to additional meetings. Keep an eye on the email. We will be having some other, I think, very relevant presentations. June 10th, you will have a presentation from the IMF that will present a macro model trying to estimate economic impact of disasters. The focus is on natural disasters, but there are some common points that could be useful and anyway remain relevant, even for those of you who are working on climate change. That said, thank you all again. Thank you, Nico. Thank you, Kalle. Have a nice day.